the clash of steel, the sizzle of spells, the battle cries and warnings, all part of what combat is like in the world of myth. Hi, my name is Ross Watson. I'm the lead designer of Myth Tales of Legend.
And I am J.M. DeFogie, and I'm the lead writer of Myth Tales of Legend.
We both hope you guys are staying safe out there. We value our fans greatly. Today's episode, what is today's episode all about?
So today's episode, we're going to talk not all about. We're going to talk about combat in Myth and how it's resolved, what options you have in combat, and this is going to be the first of several videos, kind of detailing out, how to kill things in Myth and how not to be killed by things in Myth.
Yeah, and there's a lot to go over, so we're just going to start with the pretty basics. First of all, you can really look at the overview of combat in Myth as a 5-step process. Step 1, you set the scene. Step 2, you determine surprise. Step 3, you roll initiative. Step 4, you take turns. And on step 5, the round ends, you start over.
And then step 6, profit.
So, Jan, when I say step 1 is set the scene, what does that say to you?
I mean, this is sort of something we all do as GMs, but sometimes we may kind of skip over this if combat just sort of pounces, or kind of the PCs grow restless and they draw a steal. This, with Myth being so narrative, this is the point where you kind of stop and assess the situation, kind of set the scenario for the players, really let the players kind of also help you kind of discuss what's going on. But like this is whether you're drawing a map or you're just doing theater of the mind, this is the step where you're like, here's where we're at right at the start of combat. What interesting things are going on? What do the enemies look like? Where are the PCs at? Just kind of build that narrative in your head so that everyone is kind of on the same page going forward.
Yeah, it's the traditional who, what, when, where, why.
Yep.
And it's all important because context informs everything else. Mm-hmm. Like step 2, which is determine surprise. And from the context of what Jan was talking about, like if he sets the scene and says, okay, you guys walk into a room, there's a failed perception test, we're surprised. Mm-hmm. There's a surprise situation there. The alternative is that, setting the scene is there's, some guards on patrol and they haven't detected you yet, mm-hmm. which means that a possibly successful stealth roll could mean you get surprised.
Or you've been laying in ambush waiting for the grubbers to come down the forest path, right? They're in or behind the trees, and now this patrol has finally arrived in your ambush spot.
So once you've determined if there's a surprise, and let's be honest, most battle situations mm-hmm. are not going to include this, but it's always important just to be really quick, like, is either side surprised? Cool. Move on to the next step.
So I got a question.
And then
So what happens if someone's surprised?
Well, if they're surprised, there is a surprise round. You get to act. They get like one action each.
Okay, so it's not like a full turn. It's you get one action.
Like a round. Yeah, there's like a round, but they all get to do a thing before you do a thing. And then there's rolling initiative. So let's talk about that. JM.
All right, so just one of the design things that I like that you did with this, Ross, is that speed is both how far you can move and how fast you react. So you kind of link those two things. So basically, you're going to make a test. And if you don't know what a test is in Myth, please go back and look at our other videos where we discuss the system of Myth and explain what tests are. But basically, you're going to test your speed, which does give elves and Tavians a bit of an advantage. They tend to move a little faster than humans. Dwarves move and react a little slower. Maybe it's their stubbornness. Maybe it's just their confidence in dwarven superiority. But they tend to move a little slower and react a little slower. So you're going to make a speed test, and the monsters in the best area are going to have a speed trait as well.
Yeah, so faster monsters will go faster in the initiative.
But it's also a tend to go faster, right? Because you're testing it and you're organizing by successes.
Yeah, because you count your successes. We're gonna go through the whole initiative turn a little bit later.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, let's suffice to say there's some factors that can get involved. But by and large, the faster you are, the better initiative stat or the better initiative you're going to roll.
Right.
Okay, so that as part of the overview, that's all we need to say right now.
I was diving too deep.
And then, no, we're going to get into it. I bet everybody's out there just like, come on, talk more about initiative. Right. Well, we will.
That's all I want to do is talk about initiative. So.
Well, we're going to take turns, just like we're
in combat.
Just like we're in combat. And the next step is for everybody to take their turn on their initiative step. You go from the highest number of initiatives successes rolled to the lowest. Pretty simple stuff. And then step 5 is you bring things to an end, start over.
So yeah, it moves cyclical, just like most RPGs. You get to the end of the round, you kind of start back over. But combat doesn't necessarily, and we'll get into this later, doesn't necessarily have to end with everyone fighting to the death. But step 5 is kind of when you assess and decide, hey, is there another round of combat needed? What's going on? What's going on in the scene? So,
it's funny. I didn't actually include this in the show notes, but when you brought up surprise, I was like, oh, I should probably talk more about how surprise works. And now, surprise would be a great time to talk about surprise.
Caught me off guard, Ross.
So, how surprise works goes like this. If you are surprised, anybody who is not surprised gets to act. You are surprised, you do not get to act. That is the first round of combat. Okay. You can spend resources to not be surprised. The game master can spend threat for some of his guys to not be surprised. The player's characters can spend serendipity for their guys to not be surprised. By and large, perception is the stat that's going to determine whether or not you are surprised. And that's really all that it means. Is if you are surprised, there's a round in which you do not get to act. Pretty simple.
And it's an interesting choice because you're basically saying spend these resources that are limited and will help you in the battle to come against this. Do we use them now so that there is no basically free attacks on us, or do we wait and use them once the combat is started? So it's an interesting choice to put in both the players and the PC's hands.
Well, I mean, I think there's going to be two schools of thought here. I think there's going to be a lot of players, and there's nothing wrong with this. I think there's going to be a lot of players who are going to say, it's always better to act than not to act. I will spend the resource. Absolutely fine. And there's also going to be guys who are far more into the narrative and the context of the scene and say, no, it's legit. I was surprised. I should pay the penalty for that. And then you use that resource later to get revenge,
right?
Which is actually even more cooler.
Yeah.
So there's both schools of thought are perfectly fine and perfectly good to use. The resources there, or maybe it's not. Maybe you ran out of serendipity. Maybe that's the reason why you're like, oh shit, let's not run out of serendipity ever again. Let's try not to run out of serendipity, guys.
Yeah, the first time it happens, you're going to be like, well, this was a mistake.
Because then we got ambushed and we had no resource left. Anyway, so that's surprise. We can now move on to JM's favorite topic.
That's right, initiative. Rolling it. When do we roll it? How does it roll? Who gets to go in what order? But yeah, so you're going to roll your speed trait. And as any of you who may have played in a die pool game before, you know that just because you have the dice does not necessarily mean they're all going to come up successes for you. I think it's Burning Wheel that has my favorite. They have successes if the dice come up the number you need, and then traitors if they don't. And I'm like, yes, that is how you feel in the moment. So just because you have a high speed trait, you're still going in order of successes, like Ross said. So just because you are the dwarf doesn't mean that there isn't going to be that round where like you throw your speed trait and everything comes up sixes, and suddenly you're going first. You may be surprised. That may be your surprise round, is you get to go first for the first time in the campaign. But if there's a tie, how do we resolve that?
So if it's tied between a player character and a non-player character, the player character goes first.
Okay.
If it's tied between two player characters, they decide between them who goes first.
Now, is that set, or like if you and I tie, and on round two, or round one, we're like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense for Ross to go first. In round two, does Ross still go first, or do we make that decision each round?
I would the way it's set in here is you make the decision, and that's the way it goes. But I personally, as a game master, would not at all be upset if someone was like, we were tied. Do you mind if I go first this time? That makes total sense. Now, there are, as I said, factors that can change when you go in the round, besides just how well you roll. And you make a good point that there's going to be those outlying times where your solo guy is going to go quick, or your quick guys are going to go slow. But there's at least 3 different ways you can interrupt and change your position in initiative. First of all, if you're using the hold action combat option, where you're like, I'm going to wait until somebody walks through that door, you can potentially interrupt them and act right before them. But to do this, you have to succeed at an opposed speed roll between you and them. So
you're not guaranteed if you hold your action.
You're not guaranteed. No, that's a possibility.
As a GM, I like that, like on both sides, because sometimes it doesn't go the way you see it in your head. Yeah.
And now we're back to resources, because a game master can also spend threat to have one of his guys go to the top of the order and act first. Players can spend serendipity to do the exact same thing. And you, of course, I know your question is, what happens if both the player and the GM spend? Well, it's pretty simple. One player character gets to go first over one NPC, but after that, it's trade-off. So if you and the game master both spend, one of you gets to go first. But if multiple players spend to go first, they will all act after whatever the game master's done.
And so that sets your initiative for the whole combat to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because you roll initiative for a combat, and then you take turns until it's all over.
So you make those you make those decisions to spend your resources at the start of combat.
Yeah.
All right.
Now there's nothing wrong with rolling again at the beginning of each round if you prefer to shuffle. I find that it just slows down combat. Kind of pointlessly. For me, it's kind of pointless, but I totally am fine with if people are like, no, man, I want that unpredictable,
the dynamic sort of initiative.
Sure, go with it and have fun, and you shine on, you crazy diamond. But me personally, I am just going to roll once, and that's the initiative for the combat.
Well, I think that's one of the things that you've brought up multiple times in our system things, is that really when it gets to your table as the GM, run with myth the way you want to run with myth.
Yeah, and so again, this is our overview of combat episode, guys. We have a lot to talk about, so we're going to talk about now the different types of actions you can take in combat. JM, what is the first and probably most important action you can take in combat? So
basically, we call them combat actions. They are kind of the primary thing your character is focused on doing on their turn. This can be things like making an attack, casting a spell, skills that actually require time. The examples that we're looking at are things like healing, picking a lock, that sort of thing. You can do multi-actions, but you take a penalty. The more actions you do, the bigger the penalty is.
Now, keep in mind, you only get one combat action per turn, but that action can be, as JM said, split. You can on my combat action, I'm going to run and pick the lock on the door. And the game master's like, yeah, that's hard. So the difficulty just went up. Every time you take a multi-action, each additional action is a penalty that applies to everything that you do that round.
And you end up making multiple rolls.
It can be. I mean, if they're all the same pool, I think you roll once. But if it's different
pools,
I believe I believe different pools roll different times. So if you were going to attack and pick a lock, yes, those would be two things. Again, I would, as a game master, I'd be like, dude, you can't. How are you even going to see the lock?
Yeah, I would up that difficulty quite a bit.
But a canny player like JM might be like, dude, I pick locks by feel. That's how most people do it. And you'd be like, Okay, that's a really good point. And then the next thing you know, they're able to like fend off an attack and click. There, I got it.
Or I'm just gonna brute force jam my dagger into there and try and like I'm not really like trying to finesse it. I don't want it to close again. I just want it to open.
Picking.
That's right.
The lock.
Picking a lock is it's a spectrum. It's not a single instance.
Now we'll talk about you. Actually, this is the second time we've mentioned a combat option. We mentioned hold action before. Now we've mentioned multi-action. We have a whole episode later on dedicated to combat options. Just trust us. We'll get into it later.
You got a lot of options in your hands as a player, as opposed to just
one combat action a round. Yep. The point is one combat action per round, and it is the main focus of what your character is trying to do. Then you have your free actions, and you can have any number of free actions. This is up to the game master to sort of say, okay, you've done enough. But free actions can include things like readying a weapon, speaking a short, simple sentence, or opening an unlocked door. Just basic things that you don't require a lot of time or attention from your character to do. Again, the game master needs to be the one to step in and be like, okay, you've opened the unlocked door, you drew your dagger, and you told everybody, look out for the dragon. You're done. You're done. That's it. That's all you can do.
It's a GM, but I do love the fact, and this goes back to years of gaming, where readying a weapon takes your whole turn, and it's just like, all right, well, I guess I'm just doing that. No, here it's a free action.
You know what that led to, in all my years of gaming. What that led to was people, constantly saying like, my character walks around with an unsheathed sword, or at the merest hint of anything happening, I draw my blade. Like that was the very first thing anybody said, to get it out of the way so that when combat started, you didn't need to waste time getting out your weapon. And that persists. I mean, there's games today that are still like, you better mention that you got it in your hand. Myth is a little more narrative, and that's why drawing weapons a free action. So it's a little less of it should be more of a, I respond to danger kind of thing. That's just how Myth works. There's nothing, I'm not slamming those other games in the past. So, JM, what is another type of action?
So you also have reflexive actions. This is basically, you can do one a turn. So it is basically your ability to respond to something else outside of your normal kind of turn order.
There's various special abilities that grant you a reflexive action. Essentially, it's an immediate response. So if you have a special ability that says, as a reaction, a reflexive action, you can do the following thing. That's how this works. And you get one per turn. It lets you do a thing in response to someone else doing a thing when it's not your turn. Pretty simple. And then there's, speaking of simple.
Yeah, there you go. What a great segue.
Speaking of simple, there's the simple actions. JM, what is a example of a simple action?
If I'm going to, if a player wants to climb up a ladder or climb a wall to get to a new position, make a very easy sort of skill check, I may allow that to be a simple action, right? It's using something that isn't sort of their primary focus, but may be necessary to get them where they need to be or what they need to do as their combat action.
Yeah, and some examples could be, this is where you have a skill that doesn't take a lot of time. Like, I want to use a perception check, a perception test to look around and count the number of bad guys we have. Yeah. Or I want to make an athletics test to get up on top of the table in the bar and get an advantage over this guy.
What do I know about these creatures? Well, that's a simple action, like make a lore check.
Right. And that's a once per turn thing as well. Actually, a lot of your archetype abilities and a lot of your talents and even some spells are simple actions to use. You only get one a turn, so you kind of have to be careful about how am I going to use my simple action. Should be one of the things you're thinking about when you're in a combat game or a combat round in Myth. But yeah, it's fairly simple. You get one a turn. And lastly,
so there are threat actions, and so threat actions are GM only things. They're either related to a threat category. So we have set up things like all insectoids, so all of the crawlers they have a group threat ability, but then each individual monster may have something it's kind of a bonus that they get to do. It'll tell you how to use it, but they all cost threat. They're basically the thing that makes the monster unique, in addition to claws and fangs and weapons and all the other sort of things that you can do with a creature in or an NPC in Myth. They're also going to have some special abilities that require you to spend threat to use them.
Right. So, for example, crawlers have a species threat ability called Scuttle, and because crawlers scuttle, and you can spend a point of threat, and they can move up to half their speed, and that includes climbing.
Yeah.
So they're not slowed down by terrain when they do that. So it can be a thing of like, oh, this crawler it couldn't quite get to me. Game Master's like, I spend a point of threat, and he scuttles a little bit closer, climbs up the little wall that you're perched on, and the next thing you know, you're like,
There's a crawler in my face. Yeah.
There's a crawler in your face. So that's how a threat action might work.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are bosses or captains and bosses, which are your special enemies, and they have even more threat actions. And I mean, there's the dynamic enemies, the ones that have the particular template that includes a whole suite of actions. Stuff we'll get into later,
right.
But bottom line, threat actions only for the GM, and they cost threat.
Exactly.
So that's actions in a nutshell. JM, what about movements? We were talking about movement. How do I move around?
So basically, if you're doing your standard move, you move your speed in meters. Each square is 1 meter. If you're using a map, pretty simple. If you're using the tiles from the Myth board game, which we recommend, 1 square is 1 meter. But if you want to do more, we have other ways for you to, there are going to be those times where, right, if you want to double move, that takes your combat action. Now, again, as Ross pointed out, with multi-action, you can run and make an attack. You're just at a penalty to do so because you're sort of splitting your focus. If you do nothing but move, for when that real scary thing comes out and you've decided that the rest of the group, you just have to move faster than them, you can sprint. Which is triple your move, but you can't do anything else. And of course, creatures and spells and different things are going to give you other movement types. Crawling, tunneling, flying, climbing, jumping.
Yeah.
I really don't know if there's any other movement types. Oh, swimming.
Swimming.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah, so swimming, they're all just slightly different types of movement. And I mean, this isn't just, normal people can, of course, climb and jump and swim. They can't fly, per se. But yeah, there's going to be some minor modifications to how you move depending on what type of movement you have. By and large, most enemies are just going to move around on the ground. So there you go. Although we did talk about crawlers and their scuttling. So.
Yeah. And so kind of going back to our first step of setting the scene, when you set that scene, you're going to want to include things that interact, like terrain pieces that interact with the PCs and affects their movement. Things like terrain and cover. Ross, you want to give us an overview on terrain and cover?
Sure. Difficult terrain is pretty much anything that you as a game master, like, this is not easy to move around in. It could be anything from like slippery mud to really jagged rocks. I mean, you can kind of, as Jam says, when you set the scene, you can sort of say, listen, this is difficult terrain. Or you might even say like climbing a tree, a particularly dense tree full of leaves could be difficult terrain. In any case, whatever you're moving through difficult terrain, you cut your speed in half. It's pretty simple. Just, be careful for that difficult terrain. There is a talent that lets you move through difficult terrain easier, and things of that nature. But generally speaking, like moving through a crowd of people would also be difficult terrain.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
Like a throng, like a big, I can barely see my friend over there. Have you ever been to a rock concert? You know what I'm talking about.
Have you ever tried to get into have you ever tried not to get into the exhibitor hall at Gen Con when they open the doors? You don't have a choice. You just get swept along into the exhibitor hall because
that's a human way.
It is.
Yeah.
It is a river of people.
Not this year, though.
Nope.
Not this year.
No, not this year.
So cover is the second part of this equation, and it's a two-parter. JM.
So yeah,
how does cover work?
So cover is basically anything you want to hide behind to prevent you from getting hit. Crates, boxes, jump behind the bar, get behind the large statue of the bear that is, right outside the tavern. If it's less than half of you, you increase your defense by 1. If it covers more than half of you, you increase your defense by 2. And I assume if it covers all of you, you just can't be hit.
Yeah, if you can't be seen at all, you can't be hit, obviously. Yeah. But it's less than half for the +1, and then half or more for the second. And that should be a fairly simple calculation for the game master. Like, it's either one or the other, and basically covers anything that's in between you and the guy that's trying to hit you. Pretty simple. Yeah. And there are talents that modify this as well. Sharpshooters, for example. So to the next part, we're talking about hiding behind cover. I love how this is segueing. It's actually going really well. Like,
it's almost as if we have a set of show notes that we're following and just kind of able to progress from one topic to the next quite simply.
Yeah, the next part is about hiding, because we talked about ambushes, and we now just talked about cover. So you're gonna hide. It happens, especially if you're a brigand or a hunter, especially if you have like a high stealth score. If there's always like a good reason for certain characters to hide if they don't want to get noticed, or if they want to try to set up like a cool surprise attack or something of the sort. So tell us about hiding.
So basically, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to roll a stealth test, and your successes sort of set the difficulty that anyone else needs to notice you. That is, very simply, that's the basis of it. You roll your stealth check. You get bonuses if you're behind cover, and the successes that you roll, that sets how difficult it is for anyone to notice you. Now, if you successfully attack from surprise, and brigands get bonuses to this, but if you successfully attack from surprise, you're going to get extra dice to hit and extra dice from damage, because surprise, they didn't know you were there, and they did not notice the shiv that you were currently sticking into their vital areas.
And there's a lot of modifiers to what's called the stealth value. It's based on lighting and noise and other factors, but generally speaking, it just goes in increments of 2. So the game master can be like, well, you're hiding, but you're making a lot of noise. So that's actually going to reduce your stealth value by 2. Or you're hiding, but it's really brightly lit, and you're making a lot of noise. So that's going to reduce your stealth value by 4. It's usually it's a 2-step for almost just about everything you do.
Which makes it really easy.
Really good master thief.
Yeah, it really makes it easy to remember and adjudicate at the table. Like, just 2s.
It's possible for a really good master thief to walk around as a one-man band and possibly still hide, but still difficult.
Really, in that scenario, the master thief should be hiding in the one-man band drum, and then no one would notice him until it is too late.
So tempted right now.
New plan for Torg.
Well, a tinkerer could easily make a one-man band.
It's true. It's true.
So this has been kind of an overview of how combat works. It's the first in a series. I think the next one we're going to talk about how to attack people, attacking, damaging, that kind of stuff. And soaking, because those are all things that happen in a combat round. And we hope you will be back to check us out for that one.
Yeah.
Jam, what's our favorite thing to see when we go look at one of our videos?
We love comments. We love talking. We love interacting with people who are excited about the Myth role-playing game. If you've stumbled across it, just let us know, hey, I found your stuff. It's interesting. Or, hey, I'd like to hear more about, if you want to hear more about how initiative works, I promise I will give you more in-depth discussions on initiative. But yeah, leave us comments, leave us questions, leave us just ideas that you have about what you're excited about for Myth. Also, check out all the other great shows that we have on the Ulysses International channel.
Speaking of rolling initiative, JM has a couple of live play games going right now. One of which is Torg, the Four Horsemen, which actually I'm in and enjoying very greatly. The other one is we
have started a new arc on the Fading Suns yesterday. Yes. It is the Curse of the Abandoned. So same characters, some new people. We had a special guest. But yes, and go back and look at Torg. We had a twist. There's a twist. Ulysses Worlds, is that the name of the kind of like the State of Ulysses show? Robert's doing a bunch of great games as well, looking at Dark Eye, Aventuria, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and there's a show now talking about the Mythboard games as well.
Oh,
anyway,
awesome.
Yeah, go check that out. And until next time,
Keep telling stories.